Hi, everybody, and hello, everybody at home. It is so great to be back for another episode of Local History Happy Hour. It's been a long time since we did this, and what a great way to get back into it. For those of you who don't know, my name is Elena Brokaw. I am the Barbara Bernard Smith Executive Director at the Museum of Ventura County. Best job in the county, although this guy actually had a pretty good one as well. Tonight, I am interviewing local, lots of things, writer, agriculture expert, photographer, avid hiker, and really a wonderful storyteller, John Krist. And we're going to be talking about his book, Living Legacy, story of, where is it? I thought I had it up here. Living Legacy, the story of Ventura County agriculture, which came out in 2007.
Yes.
And you're going to talk to us tonight about stories in the book and about a little bit about yourself and hopefully about the future of agriculture here in Ventura County, which I know everybody is interested in.
Good, as well they should be.
Yes, exactly. Affects all of us. So, before we launch into our discussion, we are here until 6 o'clock. I'm going to end a little bit early so that we can take questions from you here and you at home. So if you are at home, if you're watching on Zoom, just type your question into the Q&A section. And if you're watching on Facebook, type it into the comments section. And John and Santiago will be writing down the questions and we'll take them at about 20 to 6, quarter to 6, right about then. All right, so it's happy hour. So before we get started, John Krist, why don't you tell us about this drink that you have chosen?
Yeah, so this is called an Angelino Spritz. Apologize for the Angelino thing, but it's a product of the Ventura Spirits, which is they have a distillery on North Ventura Avenue in Ventura, and fortuitously it's located inside an old citrus packing house down there. It's been out of use for a very long time, and it's their twist on the classic Italian aperitivo, an Aperol Spritz or a Campari Spritz, and it's made using a bitter liqueur that they distill up there. The key flavor note of which is achieved using local Valencia orange peels. So it's a shout out to a local business that's making interesting use of local produce. And floating in the drink are chunks of a W. Murcott tangerine provided by my friends Tony and Ann Thatcher and his daughter and son at Friends Ranches. So citrus growers up in the Ojai Valley. Wonderful people, growing in a very difficult place up there. So, and it was also a shout out to, my parents didn't drink a lot when I was a kid, but the one drink they always had at holidays was Campari. So Italian bitter drinks like are a real memory tick for me. So I really love them. So it's an ode to all of that.
Well, it's quite delicious, and they're going down fast, so the bartender should be ready to do some refill. Can all of you here in the room hear us okay? Everybody can hear us? No? You having a little bit of trouble? I wonder if we might turn off the air conditioning, maybe, and that might make it better for those of us in the room. Okay, so the book. Let's talk about Living Legacy. It's really much more than a book. It's actually a culmination of a series of articles that you wrote when you were a full-time journalist for the Ventura County Star. Do you remember that back then?
Vaguely.
And it is, as the title says, it's really the full story of our agriculture from the beginning of recorded history until now. And it talks about our county's agriculture through the stories of individual farmers and ranchers.
Right.
So to kind of set the tone for those of you who haven't read the book, can you read an excerpt?
So yeah, I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction, which kind of sets up the reason behind the newspaper series, which lasted the entire year of 2006. We published a story every month. I worked on it full time for that entire year, and then turned those stories into a book in 2007. But it sort of grew out of the sense that Ventura County residents, whether they're farmers or not, are surrounded by farming. And yet most of them really have no idea, nor should they, I suppose, what actually goes on there. So, that helps a lot.
That's much better, yes.
So, yeah, I just wanted to sort of help the community understand a little bit more about this amazing industry that shapes the county. So So this is the introduction, from the introduction to the book. It is one of those postcard-perfect winter days that have lured settlers to Southern California for generations, and Jim Churchill is walking through the Ojai Valley orchard he inherited from his dad. He's surrounded by trees loaded with fruit, globular bursts of color scattered liberally amid the glossy green leaves, like Christmas ornaments hung with more enthusiasm than discretion. Most are tangerines of various varieties, along with grapefruits, limes, and other types of citrus. As he walks and talks about the vagaries of fruit production, Churchill stops to pluck a bright yellow globe from a drooping branch and slices it into bite-sized pieces with a pocket knife. "You have to taste this," he says, handing it to a visitor. And then the scene is repeated, each sample unleashing a burst of flavor and a cascade of sticky nectar. This is the romantic magic of farming, and of citrus farming in particular. Sunshine, water, and soil transmuted by some sort of biochemical alchemy into mouthfuls of sweet juice, neatly packaged and hanging right there for the plucking. If you could take that blue sky and the winter warmth spilling down over the Ojai Valley on this sunlit February day, squeeze out their essence and distill it, you'd end up with something like a ripe orange or tangerine. But anyone who's owned or worked on a farm or ranch knows there's very little that's romantic or magical about the day-to-day routine. The work is typically hard, usually tedious, and sometimes dangerous. And at the end of the day, the owners of farms and ranches are running manufacturing businesses intended to make money. Unlike most manufacturers, however, farmers don't control conditions in their factories. Those are set by nature, which whimsically doles out profit-killing drought, frost, floods, and pests. Farming is like having a crazy business partner who periodically blows the company payroll on lottery tickets. It wasn't that long ago that most Americans lived on farms and knew these things intimately. Today, however, most people are not farmers, have never worked on a farm, and have not learned these lessons. Much of what they know about modern farming, they've learned by gazing up at green hillsides from their suburban backyards, or by looking through the windshields of their cars as they drive past the furrows at 65 miles per hour.
Beautiful. That's so great. God, and it reminds me, because I grew up on a farm, grew avocados and citrus, and my dad would never have gone anywhere without a pocket knife, right? Those of you who are farmers, right? Oh my gosh, it was absolutely necessary. All right, so that's some of the lyrical tone of the book, which makes it such a delight to read. But now I want to talk about some of the stats, the facts and figures that are in this book, because it's a great combination of those. Right. So the book is, as we talk about this, I'm going to remind everybody, it was published in 2006, started in 2004.
Yeah, the project started in 2004, planning was 2005, the writing and publishing was 2006, then the book was built out of the wreckage of all those stories in 2007.
Yeah, the wreckage of all those stories. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so there are a lot of figures and data in the book that I want to ask you about. And one of them comes on early, is that back in 2006, there were 3 acres of farmland for every 1 acre of urban development.
Yes.
So that was true then. Is that true today?
Surprisingly, it still more or less is. And of course, that 3-to-1 ratio, there's a little over 300,000 acres of agricultural land, according to the state of California's Farmland Mapping and Monitoring Program. About 200,000 of that is rangeland in the hills, okay, which generates very little actual value in terms of economic activity. There's about 98,000 irrigated acres, which is planted cropland, harvested cropland, because basically if it's not irrigated, it's not cropland anymore. And there's about 105,000 urbanized acres. So it's 3-to-1 if you take everything into account, and it's about 1-to-1 if you just look at orchards and vegetable fields and berry fields. And it really, there's been a slight decrease by several thousand acres in total farmland over that time period, but the ratio hasn't changed that much, which is, to me, a little short of miraculous. Given the challenges out there. And
is that because of SOAR, do you think? I mean, SOAR had happened before
yeah.
your book came out.
So there's a whole passage in the book where I look at the effects, sort of the pace of urbanization before SOAR and after SOAR, and it didn't really change very much. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, we watched the cities sprawl out over the Oxnard Plain and then Las Posas Valley and everything for many years, and that development was accomplished at the price of paving farmland. But for a long time, a lot of that, we didn't see the number of agricultural acres go down to the degree that you would expect it to. And that's because, once drip irrigation had become perfected, farmers could plant trees on hillsides. They didn't have to furrow or flood irrigate anymore. And so we saw thousands of acres of basically avocado orchards brought into production on what used to be rangeland, and it kind of, just in a pure numbers sense, offset the loss of flat farmland that was covered up by Oxnard and Camarillo and to some degree Ventura. But even when we look at just what's going on in terms of cropland converted to urban use, we still lose several hundred acres every year, and it was happening before SOAR and it continues to happen after SOAR. And I think one of the reasons for that is SOAR put boundaries around big chunks of land that had cities in them, but there was a lot of farmland inside those barriers too. And so that's been continuing to be developed.
So let's talk about about that development. So back again, when this came out, you said that the county has an unusual amount of very small farms, ranches, and ag businesses. And of course, I didn't write down exactly what that meant, but it was very, very, very small. And so a lot of them, a proliferation of them. So in an age when everything's being gobbled up and there's consolidation all over the place and hardware stores are getting bought by Home Depot, et cetera, and Amazon is eating everything in sight, have the small farms been consolidated like that as well?
That's another surprising thing over the last 20 years, not to the degree you would think. So actually, if you look at every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture does a census of agriculture. It's a nationwide thing, and then they publish these enormous statistical compendiums that break it down by state and by county. And if you look at Ventura County, so the last one came out in 2017. There'll be a new one coming out next year based on this year's census. And the previous one before that was 2012. There was very little change in the number of farms, but what happened was they actually got smaller on average. 3/4 of all the farm operations in the county are less than 50 acres in size, and that hasn't changed. The average, when I wrote the book, was 131 acres. It's now 122, so they've actually gotten a little bit smaller. Where there's been consolidation has actually been on the big end, where you've had companies buy multiple large ranches. And so there are fewer of the big farms than there used to be, but not fewer of the small farms, which is a sort of a paradoxical thing. But it's a reflection of a couple of things. First of all, the type of operation and ownership in the county is very family-centered still. It's not typical, what you would call corporate farming, giant, investor-driven corporations with operations all over the place. There's some of that, but it's family operations primarily, and they grow really super valuable crops. So you can actually make money on pieces of ground that are much smaller than you would be able to if you were in the Midwest growing corn. So that's a hopeful thing. What we're starting to see in some places is just kind of a change in ownership. Families not being able to pass it on generationally because next generation doesn't want to or whatever, and farmland passing into the hands of investor groups and or companies that farm all over the country and don't have any particular attachment to the place. And that to me is a more worrisome trend than size fluctuations.
And is that a trend? I know later on we're going to talk a little bit more about what you saw as the dangers back in 2000, whatever you and everybody saw and what you see now. Do you feel like we're at a moment in our agricultural development where we may be looking at a sea change?
Yeah. What I would say is I don't think there's ever been a time, well, there hasn't been a time in recent memory when the industry faced as large a constellation of really significant challenges. You know, it's always been, we've always had to deal with global competition. You know,
Yeah.
it's always been an export commodity driven business. But, you know, the big one, well, the big two, and they both kind of revolve around water. We've got new groundwater management regulations in place that in some areas are going to vastly decrease the amount of water that's available for crop production. And we've got the unknowns that climate change is bringing to us. And the models that have been scaled down to the regional level, you know, tell us what we already know. The hot days are going to be hotter, the droughts are going to be longer and drier. Ironically, they'll be interspersed with more powerful floods than we've ever had to deal with before, because the rain that falls is going to fall much faster. So there's a lot of, you know, there's always uncertainty involved in farming. I mean, that's a given. So the crazy business partner thing. But I don't think I've ever seen as much uncertainty about what the near and long-term future is as I do right now.
Huh, interesting. Just having grown up in a farming family, it was always like that. I'm just going to tell you, every night at the dinner table, it was all, you know, everything could turn around tomorrow and all could crashing down.
Yeah, one of the things I learned working when I started working closely with the local ag community on that series of stories is growers are the most pessimistic people I know. Oh my God, what's the next thing? It's always going to be something. And they're also the most optimistic people I know, because every morning they get up and do it again.
Yeah, yeah. It is amazing.
So it's, yeah.
All right, let's talk a little bit about you. So, you know, you're a public figure. You have been a public figure for quite a while, a couple of decades here. But I want to know, you know, where you grew up, what kind of a family you grew up in. Do you have an agricultural background, and how did you end up here? So I don't think you came from here, right? There's no Krist. We don't know the Krist farm name. Okay.
No, I did not come from here. So I was born in San Francisco, so I'm a native Californian. Fortunately, and somewhat inexplicably to me to this very day, my parents decided to go into partnership with my dad's brother and his mom, and they bought a 23-acre ranch up in wine country in Sonoma County and moved the family up there when I was 5. So we got out of the city. My dad continued to work in San Francisco for many years. He worked for IBM back in the mainframe as big as a bungalow kind of computer time, and kept those things running when you had to be as much a mechanic as a electrical engineer to keep them working. And so I grew up on a farm, 23 acres of wine grapes and prune trees.
When you were about 5?
We moved there when I was 5. So.
Did you have a tractor like this?
I drove a tractor. You do have one around here that's like several I drove growing up.
Okay, good.
So I, you know, there were 4 kids, so I have 2 brothers and a sister, and I'm the oldest. And, you know, when you're a farming family, you have built-in farm labor. So I picked fruit from the age of 5 until I finally left when I went away to college. And summers, I started working full-time summers on farms when I was 16, because I had a car and I needed gas and insurance and cash. So I worked as what I now know as a position of some trust and responsibility. I moved irrigation, but I was an irrigator, among many other things. But I drove tractors out in the sun, dug ditches, all that good stuff. I started college so this was up outside Santa Rosa, which is the county seat of Sonoma County. We were out west of town in what is now the Russian River American viticultural area. At the time, it was just, we lived out in the country. And so after high school, I went to the local community college, Santa Rosa Junior College, for 2 years. Decided I wanted to major in cultural anthropology and applied to the University of California system. And in 1978, I came to UC Santa Barbara as a sophomore transfer, junior transfer, I guess. And finished, got my degree. I have a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology. I applied to graduate school because I decided at that point I wanted to be an academic. I wanted to get a doctoral degree and teach. And I applied to.
I can see it.
You can see it now. You wouldn't have been able to see it then.
More hair.
I was a very uncomfortable public speaker for a very long time. But so I applied to a bunch of campuses. I got accepted into the doctoral programs at UCLA and Cornell in New York State, and at UCSB. And I decided, geez, who wants to move out of Santa Barbara to go someplace that freaking snows in the wintertime? So I stayed there, and I was so the PhD program is a 7-year program. It's really long. And after my first year in the graduate program, that summer I was living in the campus community up there, Isla Vista. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. It's very different now than it was back then, but it's all student housing. And summertime in IVs, there's nobody there. It's boring, really, really boring. And so I saw an ad in the campus newspaper, the UCSB Daily Nexus, saying they were looking for writers in the summer, to write stories for the paper. And I just wanted something to do, so I went into the newsroom on a kind of a whim on a summer day and said, hey, I think I can write. Gave me a story assignment.
Do you remember what it was?
I don't remember the first one. But 2 years later, I was the editor-in-chief of the campus paper. I was hardly going to any of my graduate seminars. Journalism just sucked me in, and it was such a wonderful group of people. That's what really attracted me to the newsroom. I just liked the way all the people I was around at that point thought about things and the way they approached the world and events. So at the end of that year, as editor-in-chief, I applied for a summer internship at several newspapers. And I was offered internships by the Santa Barbara News Press and the Ventura Star Free Press.
And that's what it was called.
That's what it was called at the time. It was a PM. It was an afternoon daily. And I couldn't turn down $4.50 an hour. So I took the Star because they paid and the News Press didn't. And here I am.
And there and
25 years of journalism later, I ended up at the Farm Bureau. So
that must have been, so for everybody who doesn't know, you were at the Star Free Press, which became the Star for 25 years, and full-time journalist, and then you left in 2008 to become the CEO of the Ventura County Farm Bureau.
Yep.
So that must have been somewhat difficult of a decision.
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge transition, although in retrospect, what I did as a journalist was analyze public policy, tell stories, communicate, and that's 90% of the job of the CEO of the Farm Bureau.
Huh, interesting.
And so, yeah, it was. I mean, for about a 6-year period, I at the Star, I had the best job in American journalism. So I was a special projects reporter. I got to travel all over the country. I would just dream up things that interested me, and then I would work for months on single packages of stories, and they just gave me so much freedom. I had so much support from Tim Gallagher, the editor, during that time when I was having all that fun. But then toward the end of my tenure there, the newspaper business changed. A little thing called the internet showed up, and Craigslist, free classified ads. Well, there went 50% of our ad revenue. Department stores and car dealers started selling stuff online. There went the rest of it. So there were a lot of cutbacks underway, and it became clear I was not going to be able to continue doing what I was loved doing and was I thought really good at. I mean, a year-long series of stories, thousands of column inches devoted to, farming in Ventura County, had not been done before, and it will never be done again, and it has not been done since. Nothing like that's ever going to come out of that newspaper again. They just don't have the resources for that. So when my predecessor as CEO, Rex Laird, who I got to know very closely working on the series and the book project, announced his retirement, it was a big leap that I applied. So basically the book was my audition for the job. I think I passed.
Apparently. How long were you there?
14 years.
14 years, yeah, okay, I would say you did. All right, I want to go talk about water and labor. I mean, you point out in the book, you know, then we can say the more things change, the more that they stay the same. Back then, those were the two, along with competition from foreign markets. Right. Those were the two major driving factors in agriculture. It was that way before, and it is that way now. So one of the things that you say is that regional ag displays many of the features it has from earlier days, specifically imported water, imported labor, and vulnerability to foreign competition. So everyone was interested in water then. We're all very interested in it now. Can you talk a little bit about the history of water as it pertains to agriculture and what's happening now?
Yeah, so Ventura County is really fortunate in a lot of ways. The most valuable natural resource in this county next to its climate is its groundwater. So, you know, the unusual geology of this county with all of our, you know, crumpled topography, you know, river basins separated by steep slopes that shed a lot of rain runoff. We have tremendously capacious groundwater basins just about everywhere in the county, certainly the central and western parts of the county. And in the early days of farming, when some crops were irrigated, but most were dry farmed, particularly out on the Oxnard Plain, the basins were so full that the Santa Clara River ran above ground most of the year, and if you sank a well, 10 feet deep water came shooting out of the ground under artesian pressure. Sufficient to reach the second story of a farmhouse without any pumps. So, you know, that was the earliest, when irrigated crops started coming into the crop mix in the county. Surface diversions from the rivers, the Ventura River and the Santa Clara River, supplied a lot of irrigation water, but so did groundwater. And groundwater continues to be the source of irrigation water. It's 3/4 to 80% of the supply of water used by agriculture in this county. The great thing about it is we have control over it. You know, it's local. It's not like the folks in the western San Joaquin who are dependent on the Central Valley Project or the State Water Project for water because they don't have any of their own. And when things go south up in the Delta or the Sierra Snowpack, they get cut off. Our growers utilize rain when it falls, but you know, 15 inches of rain doesn't grow much of anything that we find valuable these days. So groundwater is, you know, the main supply. For urban folks, it's a different story. So we do have imported state water coming in, and that serves 3/4 of the households in the county. Either all or in part comes from that. But the way I kind of jokingly said, it's not always imported water in the sense of it coming from outside the area. We move it from where it is to where we need it. And the very first settlement, non-Chumash settlement in the county's history, was the Mission San Buenaventura, established in 1782. And just about the first thing they did was outstrip their water supply. So they built an aqueduct from a tributary of the Ventura River up the Ventura River Valley, diversion and an aqueduct 7 miles long down the Ventura. Had to build a pressure regulating reservoir, a filtration system, so they had to move the water from where it was to where they wanted it. And we kind of still do that same thing. It's not quite as elaborate a system as others. So, yeah, I mean, water remains just the critical limiting factor. And the crop mix in the Ventura County has evolved a great deal over time. So once upon a time, you know, dry farmed lima beans. In the 1800s, it was grain, you know, wheat, barley, not irrigated. That stuff will grow on low rainfall. But everything we grow today, the high value crops, are also very water intensive crops, and they are very labor intensive as well. So we have a lot of farm workers here, and basically everything we grow is picked by hand. You know, it's hands and eyes, very little mechanized harvesting. So we have a very large labor force. It's mostly living here, but it all, to a great deal, originated, if not the actual growers, farm workers, their parents or grandparents came from south of the border.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a characteristic since the very early days. So one of the surprising things I learned doing research for the series and the book was that basically the first labor contractor in California is named Junipero Serra. So when the Spanish Franciscan mission parties came north out of Mexico, extending the mission system north out of Baja California into Alta California, they brought farm workers with them because they knew they were going to a place where there's no agriculture. And they knew that their communities they were going to establish had to be entirely self-sufficient pretty quickly because they weren't hunter-gatherers like the Chumash in our area were. So that first party that came north out of Baja that established the San Diego mission was the first one. Left the mission settlements down in Baja with 42 farm workers who were Christianized members of indigenous tribes living in Mexico associated with the mission. And 12 of them made it to San Diego. The others either died or fled during the arduous trip. And for years after that, Junipero Serra wrote to the Spanish administrators in Mexico pleading for them to send more farm workers because it was so labor intensive to produce the crops to feed them and their settlements. So that sort of set the tone. We've been importing labor ever since. So yeah, over the years, we've had Chinese, Japanese, Mexicans, the Bracero program, which started up during World War II when most able-bodied men ended up either in the military or in factories feeding the wartime ramp up of industrial capacity. There wasn't anybody left to harvest. So there have been waves of this, and we're still dependent on immigrant labor.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to get back to a little bit of data. Okay, so there is a chart in your book, it's on page 86, by the way, about where your food dollar goes.
Yeah.
Which is essentially, and of course I don't have the book, essentially gives us a snapshot of how much of it was spent on processing versus the actual product in 2004. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah.
If you remember the chart.
I remember I remember the numbers. So at the time, and this was based on a sort of a nationwide average that I think it's a USDA thing. So on average, for when of every dollar you spend on food products, 19 cents goes back to the farm. The other 81 cents is captured somewhere in between the farm and the consumer. Retail, profit margin, processing, shipping, transport, insurance, blah blah blah, all the things that go into getting something from the field to your doorstep. And that 19 cents that goes back to the farm has to cover all of the input costs: labor, fertilizer, water, overhead, rent. And so the average profit at that point on that dollar to the farm was 3 cents. So not a munificent sum. And it's you raised another question when we were talking earlier. That share is much lower than it used to be.
Yeah, it used to be like 50%
Yeah.
of the dollar was going to the farmer versus less than 20%
Yeah.
now.
And that shifted, it turned upside down over the years between like the late 50s to now. And I think I don't know all the reasons, but one possibility is I remember having a conversation with an agricultural economist back in Maine, of all places. I was on a journalism fellowship, and he had done some research indicating that the difference in how much money flows from the consumer's pocket back to the farm for farm products depends a great deal on whether, in what form you are consuming that product. Mm-hmm. So his example was, for every dollar you spend on potato chips,
right,
2.5 cents of that dollar you spend goes to the farm. If you buy Pringles, which potatoes have been cooked, mashed, extruded, very processed, what comes back is half of a cent, 0.5%. because the processing ate up everything else. And we eat a lot more processed food than we did in the 50s. And so I think as, you know, all the stuff you find in the grocery store now that's not in the produce aisle, you know, that's where a lot of farm products end up.
Right.
And that none of that money comes back to the farm.
Right.
They're
It's
very,
still all
very
made
tiny.
of food.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
So it was so surprising to me a while ago to learn there's so many lemons grown in our county, right? And I was always like, what are they using all those lemons for? And it's what are the lemons being used for? What's the end product often?
Well, yeah, there are a number of them, but the food service sector accounts for the majority of the lemon market. That's where the bulk of the crop goes, and that's used for everything from Chick-fil-A lemonade, you know, garnishes, the lemons that are on your plate at the restaurant with your fish, that are in your drink. Fresh lemons are where the money's at, but yeah.
So it was very interesting to me. All right, so the book, as I said, is the gathering in one place of a series of articles that you wrote. And that series was called, not the book, but the series was called Farming on the Edge.
Yeah.
It's kind of an ominous title, but it probably sold, I can imagine. And in the preface of the book, you say that this volume is intended to paint a portrait of Ventura County agriculture at a pivotal moment in its long history. A moment when, I'm going to start quoting, despite a heritage that reaches more than 200 years in the past, the industry's future as a robust mainstay of the local economy seems in doubt. And later on, you quote the economic forecast, I think it was out of UCSB then, report in the early 2000s, which said that rising land and labor costs would eliminate the number of farms in the county, and that eventually Ventura County's agricultural sector will be a remnant. Oh, thank you. Wow, what service. Remnant boutique business supplying local top-end restaurants, farmers markets, ecotourism, and the like. Okay, so all that was not very encouraging and was said almost 20 years ago. So what do you say today, looking back on what you were thinking back then? What's happened, what hasn't happened, and what do you think is coming up?
Yeah, that's really, so that was a really, so that was a report produced by, I think actually it was Cal Lutheran, Chuck Maxey and Bill Watkins.
Bill Watkins, yes.
And I believe it was commissioned by, I think it was commissioned by the University of California Hansen Trust. And what it does, it was an economic analysis of Ventura County ag. You know, what are the direct, induced, and indirect impacts of farming on the county economy and gross domestic product in the county. It was the first, you know, really comprehensive evaluation. And then, so they did all this, you know, employment, trends, stats, you know, acreage, crop value, and they looked at all these trends. And then sort of the second half of the report is this prognostication that they said, okay, straight line trend projection. Farms are getting smaller, there are fewer of them, profit margins are being eroded, increasing competition. At that point, this was, you know, still a lot of pressure to develop farmland in the data that they were looking at. And so their worst case scenario warning was that. It's like that, you know, if these trends continue, here's where it's likely to end up. And I'm really happy to say that those trends did not continue. They almost never continue in a linear fashion. I would still repeat the admonition, though, that yes, I still believe it's always a pivotal time, right? But you know, we've always been able. This is the question I ask toward the end of the book. There's always been a next crop, you know. So we were huge grain producing county in the 1880s, 1890s, and then a combination of things, an epic drought that wiped out basically every grain farm in California, coupled with the development of huge grain acreage in Canada and Russia, tanked the grain market. Ventura County got out of the grain market and started growing lima beans, you know. Lima beans gave way to sugar beets, gave way to fruits and vegetables. There's been this evolution over time in response largely to market forces that we have no control over. Market opportunities as well, responding to market opportunities. And that's always enabled us, the growers in this county, to stay one step ahead of, the grim reaper. And at some point, it starts looking hard to find something that's what's going to use less water than raspberries and return the profits you need to pay for $3,500 an acre rent land or $65,000 an acre purchase land. Or are we going to see the agricultural real estate market collapse because it can't be supported any longer by the profits you can make growing on it? I don't know the answer to either of those questions.
You don't?
But the other takeaway that I had personally from the work on the series, the book, and my work over the last 14 years with Farm Bureau and the grower community is I do not underestimate the creativity, passion, and dedication that people who've been farming in this county for over 100 years bring to bear to all of these problems. And if there's any place that's still going to look like this 100 years from now, we're living in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have an immense amount of respect, fondness, and faith in the ag community here.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that market forces beyond people's control, because I would push back and say that the Oxnard brothers really worked hard on that sugar tariff, right? On getting that heavy tax on sugar coming into the country, which meant, their sugar beets, there's a lot more market for them. And I think that, innovation and creativity is such a hallmark.
Yeah, and it's funny to read in the popular press that lots of comments about the immense power of the agricultural lobby. And I think in DC, when it comes to the big four commodity crops, soybeans, corn, rice, there is a fair amount. But I don't know. I was essentially a lobbyist for 14 years for the ag industry. We lost more battles than we won, that's for sure. There's not a lot of the votes in California are in the cities, not in the farms.
Yeah.
So, but and the industry. Oh, so here's an example. The industry fought for years successfully to keep Argentina out of the domestic lemon market because Argentina produces just phenomenal volumes of lemons, and if there were sound scientific phytosanitary reasons to doubt their ability to import stuff that didn't have pests and diseases coming with it. But ultimately, that battle failed to carry the day, and so last couple of years, millions of cartons of fruit have come in from Argentina, and not coincidentally, prices for lemons the last few years have sucked. And
technically speaking,
part of it's that. Part of it's also that thousands of acres planted in the Central Valley and the desert came on into the market at the same time. So there's too much fruit. It's the old story. This is a really familiar cycle in crops. Growers figure out a way to make a lot of money growing something new, raspberries, blueberries.
right?
And other people go like, hey, I can do that. You jump in, and wine grapes, cyclical the same way. Now supply exceeds demand and prices fall and people tear them out and start over with something else.
All right, we have a few minutes because we always end right at 6, so I'm going to open it up for some questions. I have more questions. And I would like you all to ask some questions if you have them, and people from home. But you're all here, so you get the first chance. Yes.
I believe the first green belt between Brokaw and Ventura, 1967 and 69 area. Do you know who initiated that? Were the guys going to preserve agriculture, or were the farmers wanting to stay there?
That's a really good question. So I will say that the landscape we live in today is not an accident. The county's had robust policies and agreements with the cities. We, as a community, collectively decided not to replicate the development patterns of the San Fernando Valley, where the only way you can tell you've moved from Van Nuys to Sherman Oaks is just the freeway signs change. So, there are green belts separating all of our urban centers, and those green belts are farmed. I think it was more of a urban population not wanting to sprawl into each other. The, I wasn't here then, so I'm not exactly sure. I've done a lot of work on local land use policy as a reporter, but yeah, that was stuff that came out of the political process.
Anybody else here in the room? Marianne, I see you looking up. I feel like you're formulating a question.
Hi. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. So the question was, it seems like right now the main source of conflict in the ag world is over water, not land, between ag and urban folks. And I totally agree. So in 2015, a new state law took effect called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It's the first time in all of its history California has endeavored to regulate groundwater use. And it takes a look at groundwater basins, particularly the very important ones, as are most of ours, and requires that new agencies be established called groundwater sustainability agencies to manage those basins and to develop sustainable groundwater management plans for them. And over, the deadline to get those plans in was 2020 for some and 2021 for the others. And those agencies have 20 years, basically, to bring supply and demand in balance. We have a number of basins here where we've been chronically overdrafting, pulling more water out than artificial and natural recharge can replace. So, when you're faced with a shrinking pool of water and all these people who are economically dependent on it and whose property values are entirely dependent on access to that water, you have the stage set for some high stakes scrambling, some scrapping over who's going to get what and how much. So in the post-SGMA world, SGMA is the abbreviation for Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there have been, so far in California, there have been 3 adjudication lawsuits filed. And an adjudication lawsuit is, when all the pumpers pulling water out of a basin basically sue each other so that a court will decide how much they all get, and it'll be divided in a fair and equitable manner. So it's it's not always a hostile interaction, but all 3 of those lawsuits are here in Ventura County. So the first was filed over the Las Posas basins, which run through the Las Posas Valley from Simi through Somas. The second was filed over the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins under the Oxnard Plain. Those are the 2 basins that are considered to be in critical overdraft in this county, and that's where the biggest reductions in groundwater pumping are going to have to occur if we don't bring more water into the area to offset it. And then the third one was the crazy one. That's the one in the Ventura River watershed, and it seeks to apportion all of the waters of the watershed, surface and groundwater, among urban pumpers, agricultural pumpers, and ecosystem services, groundwater dependent ecosystems. So the environment's going to have a share, which is unlike any adjudication that's ever happened in California. The environment was never considered a water user in the relatively small number of adjudication actions that have taken place across the state. So we live in very interesting times, and it's unfortunate because, again, the stakes are really high. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars in asset value that's at stake, depending on how much water each of the landowners is allocated. So, yeah, it's turned acrimonious in places that are used to being very congenial, and neighbors are pitted against neighbors, and it's unfortunate, but Hopefully at the end of the process, once the lawyers have cashed all their paychecks and the judge signs off on it, everybody will have enough to live with. But getting there is not easy. And we're kind of setting the bar for the rest of California, because there are going to be more, as other agencies have to ramp down their pumping throughout the state, there are going to be a lot more of these lawsuits.
And this is happening right now.
This is happening right now. I was watching the Las Posas trial this morning. Yeah, it's taking place in the Santa Barbara Superior Court.
It's interesting, we're at the Museum of Ventura County, where I work. We are planning an exhibit it's going to open in about 10 months, and it's about the second official murder that happened in Ventura County after the county was created in 1877. Thomas Wallace Moore, maybe, I know John Nichols probably knows about this, and it was over land ownership, but the precipitating factor was Thomas Moore. A lot of people were saying that he didn't own the land. After 2 years of drought, he tried to create a water district, his own water district, and he was killed. Because of it. Terrible. Shot 11 times, and there was a big trial.
Oh.
But it's just so interesting talking about the through
Man,
line.
once is murder, 11 times is a message.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, so far it hasn't come to shooting yet, but I don't know. Yeah, I think a lot of the, fingers crossed, what people are hoping for, particularly, the Las Posas basins are in generally pretty good shape. The Santa Clara River Valley basins are in pretty good shape. It's out on the Oxnard Plain where we have really intensive per acre water use because of the berries and rotational vegetable crops. They're just thirstier. And that's where the overdraft is, and that's where the seawater intrusion is. It's also where more than half of the agricultural value of the county is generated. So, yeah, out there the stakes are crazy high.
Yeah.
Hi.
And repeat that.
So the question was how much food waste occurs between basically the farm and the consumer. It's a good question. I don't know the answer exactly. I can't give you like pounds per acre or anything like that. I will say a lot of food waste occurs on the consumer end. A lot of waste occurs in the retail setting. A fair amount of waste on the farm is driven by the way the market treats produce that's less than perfect. So what we grow in Ventura County is fruits and vegetables for the fresh market. That's where the highest value. Processing tomatoes like the Central Valley does. We don't grow, potatoes to be made into Pringles. And one of the consequences of that is it has to be cosmetically perfect or people don't buy it. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, farming's a business. There's got to be a market. If there's no market for it, then it has no value. And one of the dilemmas lemon growers have been facing this season is because the market's been so soft, prices have been so low, and the volume that's being purchased is really low. So there's a lot of unsold fruit, and if you can't sell it as fresh, you got two choices. You've already paid to harvest it and wash it and store it. You can throw it out, or you can send it to the products plant, the juice plant, the oil plant, which is where a lot of that fruit that was, picked and couldn't be sold went. Problem is that the packing houses and the growers lost money on every single bin of that fruit. So they paid to harvest it, and then it didn't cover the harvest costs. So you're actually better off letting it fall on the ground. You save money that way. So that's why you're seeing a lot of lemons on the ground anyway. But it's kind of the case with with all these products. Again, the only time I've seen really horrible looking fruit in the United States in a produce was a little store in some remote town up in Alaska. And it's exactly that. The only fruit available was terrible. So that's what they had. Yeah, if you had bad fruit, ugly looking fruit next to pretty fruit in the store, only one of those piles is going to sell.
I think, yes, one more, Todd.
As climate changes, the farmers are looking for new crops. Is anyone that's come to mind? We've had a banana plantation here with friends who claims we're going to be the coffee capital as temperatures change. So the farmers looking at any particular new crops?
Okay, so to repeat the question, so are farmers looking at any particular new crops as a way of dealing with climate change? Farmers are always looking at new crops, evaluating new crops. Sometimes it works out. I mean, raspberries, if you go back 20 years, there were no raspberries being grown in this county. This most recent year's crop report, for the first time, blackberries are in the top 10. That's never happened before. So, these are crops that some enterprising growers experimented with, and it's a rocky few first years until you figure out how to make it work here in our climate and our soil and our water regime. How do you build up the infrastructure that's needed to take it to market, transport, processing, all that kind of stuff. It can take some time. The most recent cautionary example of that is the growers who 3 years ago decided to take advantage of the legalization of hemp and cannabis, and they wanted to grow industrial hemp. It's tailor-made for a changed climate. It's heat resistant, hardly needs any water, doesn't need any pesticides, produces amazing number of different possible commodities, and will grow quite nicely here. And so we had several thousand acres in the ground, and two things happened. One was sort of what you would expect from a sort of a brand new commodity. The transportation, processing, infrastructure wasn't there. So you had growers with hemp and no place to send it to dry, nobody to process it and extract the oils. People promised, signed contracts, they reneged on them. So you had all that. And then the County Board of Supervisors adopted a moratorium on production of industrial hemp because the urban population complained about the smell. That's the first time in county history that the county government declared illegal a legal agricultural crop because the neighbors objected to it. So it's one of the last things I did as CEO of the Farm Bureau is we sued the county and forced them into negotiation on the permanent ordinance, which is marginally better, but last year I think there was 60 acres of hemp instead of 3,000. So, it's not always as easy as you would like it to be to go to a new crop.
That was my son, who happened to call me right at 6 o'clock. So apparently it's time for us to be over. John, I want to thank you. I want to thank all of you for being here and everybody at home. I also want to thank our policymakers. Todd Collard asked a couple of questions. He was a former city council person in Ventura, and Andy Sobel is here from the Santa Paula City Council. So thank you for making the tough policy decisions that help our sector continue. And John, thank you. And what are you going to write next?
So yeah, I retired at the first of the year. So now I'm just some retired dude who shows up once in a while and talks. Yeah, my partner Leslie Levins, who's in the back there, and I have a 2-year-old Sprinter camper van, and we are traveling a great deal. And a few months ago, I started writing again, doing the kind of writing I used to do for the newspaper, traveling around the country and talking to people and telling stories about the landscape and the things we find. And it's published online on my website. You can go to johnkrist.com and click on blog and join us on our travels.
And we'll send you, those of you who registered, we'll send you a little follow-up with a link to his blog. And if you didn't register and you want it, just email me or anybody else at the museum. John, Thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure too.